The Gator Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SCC. And joining me for this episode is Will Miles, co-host of Gators Breakdown. You can find his site at readandreaction.com and on Twitter at Will Miles SCC. Will, I'm recharged and ready to go.
Well, that's good, man. You must have like heavy lights like shining on you or something because you don't look like you got a lot of sun, even though you had all those pictures at the beach. So.
Yeah, that's the thing about my wife Kaylee being a skin cancer nurse is there are gobs and gobs of sunblock, so I am taken care of in that department.
Well, the good news is there's proof you were there because of all the pictures that you post on social media. So it wasn't just you taking a break from the craziness. Well, I mean, it was you taking a break from the craziness.
And that was about the only time I was on social media as well to post pictures, and then putting the phone down.
Well, I'm glad you had a good time, and now crazy stuff needs to happen because you're not allowed to take a week-long break without all hell breaking loose. So
yeah,
good to be back.
Yeah, a couple transfers, of course. Rashad Jackson and Kylan Johnson, you and I kind of talked about before we came on air here. Just maybe some depth issues if Florida gets the injury bug, of course, there. And, of course, Bernie moving to linebacker now, and Edwards not necessarily, as you brought up, not necessarily probably being able to be counted on come fall time. So that was the kind of news that went this past week is some transfers, and with Steele and Jalen Jones, transfer has kind of a lot of this is going to happen in our coach's early tenure because that guys get passed up on the depth chart of the guys that Dan Mullen has brought in now. So it's expected for guys who have been in the program that were Jim McElwain recruits, but now Dan Mullen has kind of come in to recruiting classes, and those guys feel like they're getting passed up on the depth chart.
Yeah, Grantham's going to earn his money this season just because of all the chairs he's going to have to shuffle around with some of the some of the attrition that's going on this year. I mean, you already look at it. You got Edwards, Jackson, Johnson, Chris Steele, and DeJuan Black, guys that they potentially could have counted on this season that they're not going to be able to. So that doesn't mean there aren't good players still in place, but it does mean that at least on the defensive side of the ball, there are going to be some things that need to be shuffled around, and they were already doing that a little bit, bringing Bernie in at linebacker. So, but when the depth is impacted on the backside there, then taking Bernie from his sort of traditional safety spot, putting him at linebacker, starts to make a difference. So certainly the health of Wilson coming back at corner is going to be very, very, very important for the season, and then Grantham's going to have to do a good job.
Well, about my favorite time of year rolls around here, and that was the preview magazines are out, and we'll dive into deep into those. My favorite part of those are what opposing coaches say about each other anonymously. So we'll get into that of what the SEC coaches, or I guess it could be FSU or Willie Taggart, his staff maybe too, talking about Dan Mullen and that too, I guess. But I would assume it's probably SEC coaches that they get the opinions of there. But before we do that, remember you can find Gators Breakdown on newsforjacks.com/Gators Breakdown. There you'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes. Also, catch the podcast, iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, Spotify. When using those services, please share, rate, and review the show. And on social media, follow Gators Breakdown on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. So, Will, I felt like I struck gold when the Athlon and Lindy's magazines were released right before vacation because I knew my flights were going to consist of 5-hour flights to down to St. Lucia and me consuming these college football preview magazines on the way and on the way back.
Hey, you're not making us feel bad for you there, Dave.
Oh no, yeah, that was not meant to. That was an added bonus to the vacation.
Well, living the life as the CEO of Gators Breakdown. I'll tell you that much. Everything gets delivered, so you didn't have to pound them when you got back. But I mean, it's always fun to start talking about football. We get into recruiting in February, and then typically sometime between February and May, there's usually some ridiculousness that goes on with the program that we need to discuss as well. And we've certainly had that this year. So now we can finally sort of sit down and say the rosters have settled and we have an idea of who's going to be there and who's going to be on each roster and, really sort of preview what's going to happen this year. And that's why we do this, right? To watch the football. And it means we're only a couple of months away and, August can't get here soon enough.
Absolutely, this is kind of the kickoff of preview season when these magazines hit around Memorial Day, the week before. It seems like it gets earlier every year when these things hit store shelves. So they want to be the first one to put them out, and they were out about the same time. So let's start with the Athlon. side of things, and they have the Gators at number 8. We'll start kind of broad here and kind of dial it down to more specifics as we go along. But Athlon has Florida ranked 8th, and their summary for the Gators reads: Gator fans had to love the last 2 games of the 18 season when UF routed Florida State and Michigan to finish with 10 wins and let the SEC know that Dan Mullen wasn't the best coach in Mississippi State history for nothing. The scary thing for everybody else in the conference is that Mullen is just getting started in his role, and once he gets a few recruiting classes into the program, things could get really interesting. One might be tempted to add, especially once he gets a quarterback, to that last sentence. But Felipe Franks made some pretty big strides for the Gators last year. He's not going to be an All-American, but he did improve his passer rating by 30 points and showed that he could be counted on to operate the Florida attack. He still has plenty of work to do, but with a bunch of proven receivers back and LaMichael Pirine around to carry the ball, the Florida offense should be pretty stout. The big news on defense is that coordinator Todd Grantham stuck around to run things for at least another season. That's good because some strong performers like sackmaster Ja'Kai Polite have left town. Linebacker David Reese, Jabari Zuniga, and corner C.J. Henderson are the stalwarts on that side of the ball. We'll learn a lot about the Gators pretty quickly because they meet up with Miami in an August 24th made-for-TV date that will kick off college football's 150th anniversary celebration and establish the Sunshine State's best. So that's what Athlon has to say, Will, as they put the Gators ranked 8th in their preseason poll. Of course, they talk about they highlight the things that we pretty much already know about. What the late game stretch, Felipe Franks' late game stretch, late season stretch as well. But one of the more popular publications that are out there, and especially in the college football preview magazine world, has the Gators as a top 10 team.
Yeah, it's funny that they focus on the offense and don't focus on the defense very much in that overview. I mean, you figure Mullen did a pretty good job of fixing the offense last year, and you suspect that they'll be better this year. A lot of the, I think, questions sort of fall on the defensive side of the ball. We talked a lot about Franks last week and sort of what we can expect from him, and and in particular, what happens if he's, if he's that player that he was the last 4 games of last year. And, obviously that's going to have a huge impact on where Florida stays ranked, but, or where Florida ends up ranked. I think end of the day, I think most of these publications are going to have Florida somewhere between 7th and 14th. And I think that's kind of a question of, do you think they're going to go 10-3, or do you think that with a little bit tougher schedule, maybe they go 9-4? And that's sort of the bet most of these guys are hedging.
Yeah, so for Athlon, I'll go to the top 10 here since Florida was ranked 8th. They had Alabama number 1 and not Clemson. They had Clemson number 2, Georgia number 3, Michigan number 4, Ohio State 5, Michigan 4. I was kind of interested. Athlon has Michigan as a college football playoff team in their rankings there. The team Florida beat in the Peach Bowl, of course. So Ohio State was number 5, Oklahoma 6, LSU 7. Team Florida beat last year. You're going to interchange. You're going to see a lot of interchanging of LSU and Florida in these rankings. We'll get to Lindy's in a minute, who even more favorable for the Gators there. So LSU 7, Florida 8, Notre Dame 9, and Texas A&M 10. So that was Texas A&M, Florida, LSU, Georgia, Alabama on the top 10. Will.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the way you would expect it to be, except for that a bunch of them have to play each other. So, so we'll see whether it ends up that way last year. There's no UCF in there, Dave?
Okay, that was top 10. Let's see. Athlon did have UCF, I think 22nd. There we go. UCF 22nd. And that is 2 spots behind Auburn at 20.
Huh. Well, that's interesting. I haven't heard any complaining though from them yet. So
here's the thing that did catch my catch my eye. We hear starting at number 14 is Penn State, 15 Oregon, but remember I said Penn State at 14. There's a Big Ten team. Oregon 15. Michigan State 16, Nebraska 17, Iowa 18, Wisconsin 19. So you have a run of Big Ten teams right there, starting at Penn State for 14 to Wisconsin all the way at 19th. Oregon is the only Pac-12 team that kind of breaks up the Big Ten kind of cluster right there.
Yeah, I think that says a lot about Ohio State and Michigan, right? And the expectations there. I think they kind of expect those two teams probably to go undefeated, and then one of them beats the other one at the end of the year, and that's who goes to the playoff. Which, let's be honest, that's kind of what the Big Ten is almost every year, unless Ohio State and Michigan, unless Ohio State and Michigan are having down years. So. When that happens, you're going to have a bunch of sort of middle of the road teams, which, to be honest, is kind of what the Big Ten is these days. It's those two guys at the top, and then everybody else sort of below them. So the SEC obviously is a little bit more balanced, I think. I mean, Alabama obviously has been the monster the last few years. Georgia, you sort of think of as building up to that, but if you look at the top 10 of any recruiting rankings, it's usually got 7 SEC teams in it anyway. So, I think there's probably a little bit more balance, though obviously it's pretty top heavy with Alabama at the top.
Yep. So let's go to Lindy's and what Lindy's has to say here. They had Clemson number 1, Alabama 2, Georgia 3. So Georgia 3 in both polls, Oklahoma 4, Michigan 5, and the Florida Gators at number 6 in Lindy's there. So their quick summary here. Mullen has Gators back on the brink of big things. In his first season as Florida's coach, Dan Mullen proved he was the right man for the job. A program that has been maddeningly inconsistent in recent seasons has a momentum of a 10-win season and dominant Peach Bowl victory over Michigan. The 2-step goal knocked Georgia off its perch in the SEC East and reached the college football playoff is more reality than fantasy there. So the good news, they say here, Mullen's reputation as an offensive savant was proven as quarterback Felipe Franks gained consistency and was particularly potent at season's end. The Gators averaged 35 points a game and helped bring fever and fervor back to the swamp. The bad news, and of course we've all hit on this, 3 of the top players on defense, defensive end Ja'Kai Polite, safety Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, more nickelback there, of course, linebacker Vashawn Joseph, departed early for the NFL draft. The Gators allowed 101 points in their 3 losses. The offense is good, but not good enough to win too many shootouts. Lindy's call here. Florida took a step toward SEC East bully Georgia last season, winning 2 more conference games than in 2017. And now we'll try to claw the rest of the way to the Bulldogs. If Franks continues to improve his accuracy, the Gators will continue to close the gap and win 10+ again. So what caught my eye, Will, in Lindy's little summaries here is pointing it out there that Florida allowed 101 points in their 3 losses. And also, there's a lot of Florida-Georgia comparison talk there in that short summary from Lindy's.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what we've been hearing all offseason, right? Is Florida has to get over that Georgia hump. I think having the teams at 6th and 8th, really the reason or the reasoning there I get, which is basically they think Florida is much better than Miami. They think Florida is better than Auburn. So then you've got 2 real games on the schedule where Florida maybe isn't scheduled. The game at LSU and then the neutral site game against Georgia. They should be favored against Florida State. Got sort of maybe a trap game at Missouri. But, at the end of the day, if you look at where Florida should be favored and where they're going to come in against teams that are beat up, really – they've got Towson the week before Auburn, which means they should be pretty healthy when that starts. They've got a bye week after the Miami game, so they can get healthy after that one. There's sort of 2 bye weeks built in anyway this year, so health really isn't going to be a huge concern. So really, I look at the schedule and I say you got Auburn, LSU, and South Carolina, and that's sort of a key stretch, and then you've got Georgia, and the only games I can imagine they might not be favored in are those LSU and Georgia games. Mm-hmm. You go 10-2, you're going to be a top 10 team when you get to the bowl game. So I think that's kind of where they're coming from, and it makes sense to me. Whether or not Florida's defense is good enough to build on what they did last year, because like you said, giving up 100 points over 3 games is problematic, because those 3 games were not necessarily against offensive juggernauts. I mean, they made Terry Wilson, the quarterback for Kentucky, look like a really, really good player. And I know Marco Wilson was early.
That's the bad thing about that game was that was probably Terry Wilson's best game of the season. But as we said, it was early on in Mullen's tenure, early on in a new defense. You had Marco Wilson go down, CeCe Jefferson, David Reese didn't play. So there were a lot of things that contributed to that. But still, in that mid-season stretch where you had the Georgia and Missouri games back-to-back, and when your best defensive player, Ja'Kai Polite, you go back and look at those 2 games, he was non-existent.
Yeah, well, and one of the things I think they're going to have to do from an offensive side is get off to better starts. So you think about the game against LSU; they were
Oh, my
behind
favorite stat.
they were behind 7-0, and I think it was Polite or maybe it was Zuniga was able to get the strip sack
Right.
that sort of turned that game at least into a competition because LSU was driving again, looked like they might be up 14-0. You go back to the South Carolina game; they were behind almost that entire game. The Missouri game, they were behind that game and got destroyed. The Georgia game, they were behind in that game very quickly early on, and even in the Florida State and Michigan games, they weren't they weren't necessarily behind, but the games were pretty tight at the half. It wasn't until in the second half when they really came out and and took control of those games against, at least with Florida State, a team that was overmatched on the field. I think Michigan was a little bit too, just because of some of the people they were missing. So again, I think you look at it and say the way the offense is going to have to help the defense is by getting off to starts that are much more like the tail end of the games last year that we saw.
Yeah, my favorite stat that I tracked last year, besides the Idaho game, the last time Florida scored a first quarter touchdown was against Tennessee. So that's it was the offense has to get off to better starts for sure.
Well, those Tennessee touchdowns roll off of turnovers. I mean, they had the ball like the 4-yard line after Ankrum had an interception, and
that is the big thing for me on offense for sure is they have got to get off to better starts.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. So that was Florida at 6 there on Lindy's. They had Ohio State 7, LSU 8, Notre Dame 9, Oregon 10, Texas 11, 12, Utah. And looking at, that's my team this year. That's my surprise team is Utah. Going and looking at both of the preseason magazines and kind of reading up on Utah and what they bring back, especially along the defensive line. Their quarterback and running back were hurt late last year. They pretty much bring everybody back from the team that kind of exceeded expectations last year, kind of fell short last year in the Pac-12 title game against Washington because they were playing with a backup running back and quarterback. Utah's my team to watch out for.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to plead ignorance.
Utah. I kind of was there as well until, like I said, that's one reason I get these magazines to kind of as a refresher from last year and kind of keep up this year. And yeah, that's I remembered all that happening, but it was not at the forefront of my mind until I read these magazines again.
Well, I do think what this tells you is that USC's coach is probably on the hot seat because that program is constantly recruiting better than anybody else in the Pac-12, and so for them not to just be a consistent winner in that conference really says something about the coaching and the development there. That if you took that kind of talent with Mullen's level of coaching, you figured that they'd win every year and have no problem, and they did with Pete Carroll, and they even won, I think, more consistently with Lane Kiffin out there. So and with Orgeron out there. So I think it says something about Helton and potentially says something about Peterson at Washington too. But I mean, this is one of the things that we always sort of argue about every year is how much does returning talent make a difference versus how much does just raw talent make a difference. And last year, I think Florida had an awful lot of returning talent. It just wasn't necessarily talent that had performed, at least not in 2017. Obviously, a lot of those guys turned the corner and were able to perform last year. Now we're coming into a year where Florida, at least in particular places, has sort of a dearth of returning talent. But I think some of those guys might end up being better. So, over the long term. So we'll see how quickly they can get up to speed.
Well, count these number of teams for me as I go through this. Georgia, number 3. LSU, number 8. Auburn, 15. Miami, 19. Missouri, 24.
Yeah, 5.
All those teams are ranked, and that's all those teams Florida plays,
Okay.
according to Lindy's there. So 5 ranked teams, according to Lindy's, that are on the Gator schedule.
Yeah, well, you do have Tennessee at home, so that's nice.
Yep.
I think South Carolina may actually be a pretty good team this year. It's just that they're playing such an awful schedule that they're going to be beat up by the time Florida heads up to Columbia. I'm actually surprised Missouri's ranked. I kind of figured with Locke leaving that would be something that they fell off the mark a little bit this year. And then, the other thing is I don't think Taggart's a particularly good coach. I've certainly expressed that, but Florida State still has quite a bit of talent. And if Briles can do a halfway decent job of getting that offense just serviceable, you figure Florida State maybe can sneak into the back end of that top 25 too. Just if the defense is halfway decent and the offense isn't just absolutely abysmal, or maybe it falls apart. But I'm kind of hoping for them to sneak into the back end of the top 25 because I'd like Taggart to be around for a while.
This is exactly where I was going to go next. They have FSU 34th, fifth best team in the ACC, and what they say is bounce back from bowl this year. That's a question there. And as you said, offensive coordinator Kendall Briles is a key factor. So that's their little short summary there for FSU.
Yeah, well, let's hope they're a little bit better, but just not good enough, and Florida can still stomp them. But
oh yeah, exactly. I want that game to mean. It was fun watching them flounder, all that. But that game is fun when it's big. And look, I like to see rivals lose. So put it this way: I either want you to be really, really bad, which is what they were last year, or pretty good, and we still beat you. We still beat your brains in.
Well, I mean, and an improvement for Florida State this year is really just having 11 guys on the field most of the time. So we're really not asking for a whole lot there. I suspect that last year was very similar to the year 2 years ago for Florida, where sort of everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. Obviously, with some of the issues they've had at quarterback and who's going to play there, and Briles has sort of his own issues where if things go poorly, you can imagine a fan base might turn on him. But Briles also has proven that he's been pretty capable when he's had offenses put into his hands, and so they don't need to be throwing the ball all over the place. They just need to not be terrible, and they'll be considerably better. And you figure their defense is still going to be pretty good. So I'm expecting Florida State to sort of be on that tail end, and that's what they said there. What they ended 34th.
Yeah,
that's a team that's borderline top 25. If they get one more win, pull off a close win, maybe they shouldn't have, get a turnover or two in a game that maybe they wouldn't have won otherwise. They sneak into the top 25. That's probably about right.
Yeah, well, they opened up the season with Boise State. So, that's here in Jacksonville, actually. So that's, a game to look out for. I'm trying to see where they have Boise State ranked 27th, Lindy's does. So, if the polls that come out or, the official polls come out, and that's about where both teams would be ranked. They don't rank past top 25, but you get those votes there. If that's similar and FSU does beat Boise State, you could probably bet the second edition of the poll would have Florida State ranked.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Like I said, I hope I want the teams in Florida to be good because then when Florida beats them, it should help them when they recruit, right? I mean, the problem right now in the state of Florida is not that the teams in Florida are good. It's that the teams in Georgia and Alabama and South Carolina are good, and those are people who are competing for your recruits as well. So, sort of one of those things where the rising tide raises all boats, and you hope all three of them play well because then the games are meaningful, and when you beat them, then you've got real bragging rights, not just state bragging rights.
All right, so here we go. SEC order of finish, Will. That's where we'll go next, and no surprise, of course, they have Florida second. Both publications do, Athlon and Lindy's. Athlon actually puts kind of a predicted order of finish together with records. So they have Florida going 10-2. They don't necessarily pick the losses, but you would assume Georgia's one of them. Maybe LSU or Auburn is the other. That's the way I would look at it there. So Athlon 10-2, 6-2 in the SEC for the Gators, and then Lindy's says second in the East as well. Good news: quarterback Felipe Franks emerged last season and has better skill at running back and wide receiver around him. Bad news, of course, the offensive line lost several key players, while the defense lost its best safety and pass rusher. No, they keep calling Chauncey Gardner-Johnson a safety, but both publications did it, so I don't necessarily get it. But I guess they don't key in as much as we do, I guess. But Chauncey Gardner-Johnson was that kind of hybrid, but more of a nickel role last year. Our call, that's what Lindy says here. Dan Mullen led Gators from 4 wins to 10. And should challenge Georgia in the East. So much of the same there as far as, and no surprise, Will, that Florida is picked second behind Georgia in the East. Athlon has Missouri third at 8-4. So basically a 2-game difference separates second and third here for Athlon, as they have Florida 10-2, Missouri 8-4. All 4 of Missouri's losses they have is coming in the SEC as well. They have South Carolina 6-6. They might take that, honestly, with that schedule. South Carolina fourth at 6-6 record there. Tennessee 7-5 overall, but 3-5 in the SEC. Has South Carolina 3-5 in the SEC as well. Kentucky dropping all the way to sixth, going 2-6 in the SEC with what they lose, 6-6 overall, and Vanderbilt finishing out the East in Athlon. Lindy's, I think, is the same. Missouri third, South Carolina fourth. Lindy's does have Kentucky fifth instead of Tennessee. They have Tennessee sixth and Vanderbilt seventh. So mostly the same with just a switch and of South Carolina and or Kentucky and Tennessee.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kentucky maybe is a team you might want to look out for. I know they lost a ton on defense, so I don't necessarily expect them to be as good on that side of the ball, but we're talking about a team that finished in the top 25 last year. Actually, I think finished in the top 15. So, some of that offense is going to be back. I'm sure that they expect there's going to be some drop off on the defensive side of the ball, but they probably also expect to see some progress on the offensive side of the ball. I think what Stoops has built there is probably something that, yes, they're going to take a step back, but how big of a step back? I mean, if you told me, is the loss of Locke or the loss of all the defensive guys at Kentucky going to
they lost Benny
Snell as well? But if you tell me Snell versus Locke, I'll tell you I think there's going to be a much bigger drop off in offense at Missouri. I mean, I think people underrate how good Locke was, and we certainly saw it because he lit up Florida the last couple of years and certainly has that ability. So. Again, I think we're probably splitting hairs here. I think there's been an overall drop-off in the teams that Florida's going to have to compete against, except for maybe South Carolina, except that South Carolina is going to be playing just a murderer's row next year with their schedule, and so probably is behind the eight ball in the SEC, pretty quickly off the bat. So, and probably pretty beat up when they come into the game against Florida as well. So it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, I think most people think it's Georgia 1, Florida 2. And so it's going to come down to that game in Jacksonville, which is really kind of how it was all through Spurrier's tenure and how it was through Urban Meyer's tenure as well. I mean, Tennessee, I guess, was a little bit better during Spurrier's tenure, but when Urban was there, it was pretty much him and Georgia, and whoever won that game was going to go to the championship. So we're sort of back to where that was, and that's kind of the pecking order of the SEC.
And where it was last year. Remember, it was a top 10 matchup. I'm not so sure Florida beats Georgia last year. They show up is empty the next week against Missouri, as they did, but it was a top 10 matchup, and looks like that's what these two publications expect again. So let's go to more detail here about the Gators, and when you can kind of fast forward through the magazine and go straight to the team preview here. I won't go through the whole preview, of course. I'll save some for you guys who want to go get the magazines out there. But I will read the quick verdict and the opposing coaches' thoughts. Like I said, my favorite part of these magazines here. But the verdict from Athlon says 10-2, 6-2 for the Gators. Dan Mullen likes to say we're the Florida Gators. In the quote there, the implication is clear. Championships are to be expected in Gainesville, and while the Gators didn't deliver a title in Mullen's first season, they made a clear statement that they are on the path back to national prominence. Despite the progress being made, Florida is still a year or two away from seriously challenging Georgia in the SEC East. The biggest issues in the short term, getting quarterback Felipe Franks to play with more consistency. He struggled in Florida's 3 losses, and plugging holes in an offensive line that lost 4 starters. The defense, led by top flight, as usual, secondary, should be strong. The Gators' fate could be decided by a key mid-season 4-game stretch that includes dates with Auburn, LSU, South Carolina, and Georgia. Only one of those is at home. So we'll, of course, saving it kind of for the summer when things are slowing down, but we'll get into the Florida schedule and kind of break it down of trap games and key stretches, and of course, opening with Miami, ending with Florida State, all that good stuff. But yeah, that of course, you go back and look at Florida's schedule in recent years. October is where the schedule is. That is what makes or breaks Florida. Another Missouri in November every now and then, has given Florida trouble. But it's usually October when you have your 2 West opponents and LSU, and then you usually book in October or usually end October with Georgia. This year it's in November because of the way the calendar falls. But yeah, that key 4-game stretch, LSU, I mean, Auburn, LSU, South Carolina, Georgia. That's going to be the Gator season out there.
Yeah, very much so. And I think they hit on all the key points, right? I mean, you got
Yep.
Franks, and can he be more consistent? And what does that? What does consistent mean with an offensive line that's missing the four
Yeah.
starters? And I went back and looked at tackles. They've got 4 returning starts, not starters, starts at
Yeah.
offensive tackle, and most of those are games against Idaho and things like that, where they let people start because they were resting other guys. They've got, Heggie's got 7 starts, Buchanan's got 12, Forsyth has 3, Banks has 1, and then everybody else is either 0 or a true freshman. So there is not a lot of experience. So, you mentioned Utah earlier and all the guys they're bringing back. Well, every quarterback is going to struggle if he's getting hit in the back when he drops back. And that's the reality. So, Franks can be a whole lot more consistent, and if they don't block as well, then that's going to be a problem. Now, I think you look at Hevessy's track record and you say, okay, he's got a pretty good track record of building offensive lines. And even last year, the offensive line in 2017 was pretty bad, and then in 2018 was considerably better. So I think the question is sort of, all these guys, what is the baseline that they start with? And then you're going to see improvement throughout the year. And the question is, can they get to average to above average by the time they hit that stretch in October? If they struggle to get there, then Florida's going to struggle. And if they improve very, very quickly through those games early in the year, then obviously Florida's going to be very formidable by the time they get to that stretch.
Oh, well, I'll give you 5 key Gators they picked out here. No need to go over the key losses. We know the key losses, of course, here. But key Gators, C.J. Henderson, cornerback. Okay, given. We know that. LaMichael Pirine, starting running back. We know that. Key Gator there. Jabari Zuniga, of course, they got to replace Jakai Polite in his production last year. I think you'll see, Grenard, Zuniga kind of team up more for that. But they do call Jabari Zuniga a complete package. And if there was one knock on what Jakai Polite did last year was, as I mentioned, that midseason stretch where he kind of went invisible, and then also getting to the quarterback wasn't necessarily a problem, but a lot of time, not a lot of discipline, went out wide. Some runs were taken his way. So, maybe a one-trick pony, and it worked. Caused turnovers, got sacks, helped turn some games around there. But with the way they're describing, Jabari Zuniga, physical at the point of attack, fast off the edge, and it's the complete package. So some high praise there for Jabari Zuniga. The wide receiver they have listed, Will, I want you to guess.
I'm assuming they're going to say Kadarius Toney.
Yes, it is Kadarius Toney. Ding, ding, ding. Kadarius Toney is the key Gator for wide receiver, not Van Jefferson, not Trevon Grimes, and the dynamic do everything. Toney averaged 10.9 yards on 46 touches from scrimmage as a sophomore. And this last line really gets me because Dan Mullen has mentioned it many times when he talks about Kadarius Toney. Less freelancing might equal more touches in 2019.
I don't know. The freelance is kind of fun.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that they go to Pirine and then they go to Toney, because those are guys I feel like we kind of know what we're going to get from them. So when you look at how the offense is going to succeed or fail next year, the guys I'd be looking at are Malik Davis. I think if you've got if he can show the same explosiveness that he showed 2 years ago when the offensive line wasn't even really playing very well,
yeah,
and he can show that against an offensive line, that hopefully an offensive line is going to be better than it was in 2017, then, if he can really provide a solid second option behind Pirine, just because he does things that are different, he's not the same guy as Pirine is. And if we get the Malik Davis from 2 years ago that, this year, I think that's a real feather in the cap for the offense, and maybe something that we're not necessarily expecting. And then at least on offense or at wide receiver, I think Grimes is the guy you got to look at. I mean, he's the guy who was able to take short passes and turn them into more. And that's something that I think's been missing in Florida's offense really ever since Percy Harvin left, is having somebody who can take that little screen and take it to the house. And there were a couple of times last year where Van Jefferson was able to shake his guy in one-on-one coverage and make a big play. But there were plays where Grimes had guys on him and was able to beat him at the line of scrimmage and really sort of take it. In one-on-one battles, I think Grimes is the guy you think you can just throw it up to him and let him go get it. And if he can do that this year, I think the offense looks pretty successful. On the defensive side, I think Trey Dean is the guy you got to look at. I mean, he's either replacing Chauncey Gardner-Johnson at the star position, Or if anything happens with Henderson or Wilson, then he's out at corner again. And then who sort of replaces him at the star position? So, and this sort of goes back to Steele transferring out to Oregon.
Yeah, it might mean Kyrie Elam has to come in and step in right away and be that guy just so they don't have to move Dean.
Very much so, but it also means Dean. I think acquitted himself pretty well last year. But when I say that, I mean for a freshman. There were instances where he got beat, and there were also instances where it looked like he got beat, where I'm not sure it was necessarily his fault. But you look at the game against Missouri. There were a few times where he got beat deep, and
the Michigan game too, the last game of the season. Yeah, he didn't fare too well early on in that game.
Well, and that's going to happen sometimes to a corner, particularly a young corner. So I don't want to pile on, but I think what I would say is that there's no guarantee that he's going to come out there and be as good or better than Gardner Johnson. And so if you're really looking at that defensive backfield and saying who's going to make a huge difference this year, I think the play of Trey Dean is really going to be important.
All right, the last key Gator they have, and I absolutely agree with this, David Reese, because we saw what happened when he wasn't on the field last year against Kentucky. There, what they say here, Reese, a 4-year starter, is the quarterback of the defense with a nose for the ball. He has 228 career tackles in 33 games.
I think this is particularly important with Jackson and Johnson transferring. Yeah. That you might have been able to paper over an injury or a game or two with Reese out. And I mean, it's difficult anyway. I mean, we certainly saw that last year. But you're going to have Hopper come in as a true freshman and sort of step into that role, or Miller jump in, or Houston, or the depth chart starts to get really, really thin because of those transfers. So yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be really important that Reese stays healthy. I think he's shown what he can do when he is healthy. So I think health is probably the question there, not necessarily ability.
Right. The rising star they have linebacker Amari Burney, converted safety that can chase down the ball carriers. Run with receivers downfield, come off the edge to blitz the quarterback or cover the flats. Defensive coordinator Todd Grantham is sure to use Burney's versatility to keep offenses guessing. And it was the thing that I pointed out the most when watching the Peach Bowl was Burney closer to the line of scrimmage. That's when we first started seeing him a kind of a good bit at linebacker. We were wondering if it was going to transfer into the spring. It did. He's looked to be a fix at the position at linebacker, and we loved his versatility when he was recruited, when he played last year, and now you have a publication here, Athlon, that's picking him to be the rising star of the Gators this fall.
Yeah, well, if you remember that Michigan game, on the first drive, they did get outside, and they were able to get to the outside. They almost scored a touchdown on a play where the running back just barely stepped out of bounds. And then from then on, Burney started to come out on the field. There's a little bit more speed side to side. Michigan wasn't getting outside anymore, and then their offense really stalled. So I think that's sort of the same thing we're going to see from Burney. If he can do that, and he can do that consistently, I mean, he is the type of athlete who can really make a difference and gives you sort of that flexibility. We talked a little bit last week about P. Ryan being out in pass routes along with the tight ends, and really sort of Mullen developing schemes to get his guys on a linebacker. Well, if you've got a guy on Burney, that may actually end up being an advantage for Florida, right? They may like having Burney one-on-one against the tight end or one-on-one against a running back. And so the scheme that you put out there as an offensive coordinator puts you at a disadvantage if you've got a player who can really be a star out there. So I'm excited to see what he can do, and excited to see whether it gives Grantham some flexibility in terms of what he can do up front.
All right, I'll save Athlon's coaching, anonymous coach thing when I do Lindy's as well. I'll do those together to kind of follow on the same theme here of what Lindy's is saying. Let's see, overview for what they do. Mullen has more tools to work with at the skill positions than he's ever had as a head coach, but his challenge will be finding a way to use them given an extremely inexperienced offensive line. Florida loses a couple top-notch players on defense, but has the depth and talent to get better on that side of the ball. If the O-line holds up, the Gators could be a serious contender in the SEC. And the key number, Will, that Lindy throws out is 54, and that is in relation to Georgia's margin of victory while beating Florida the past 2 seasons and going on to win the SEC East. 2 years ago, okay, McElwain's getting fired, tells the team before the game. We know death threats the whole week before. Okay, you knew that beatdown was probably coming there. But you go back to last year, top 10 matchup, as we said earlier, close game going into the fourth quarter. Georgia eventually pulls away there. So Of course, they're pointing out very clearly here, offensive line holds up, and Florida Georgia game in Jacksonville is going to be big.
Yeah, and this I think is maybe, if we were talking about where the key player would be, especially on defense, and no one's really said anything yet about it in either of these previews. I think you got to talk about TJ Slayton and Elijah Conliffe.
Mm.
I think the defensive tackles, maybe not necessarily over the entire year,
Yeah.
but in that Georgia game, they're gonna have to get pressure up the middle. They're gonna have to get in Fromm's face, and they were not able to do that last year, and certainly weren't able to do it 2 years ago. And part of that was Schuler came in quite a bit, and Dunlap came in quite a bit, and they played pretty well. But Slayton and Conliffe are the guys that you've recruited, that you've said these, they're the guys who have the high level of talent. They're the guys who started the season, and then after the Kentucky game, sort of fell in the background as Schuler succeeded. So I really think that to compete with Georgia, the key guys are going to be on that defensive line, and no one's really saying a whole lot about those defensive tackles.
Yeah.
But you get an injury or two there, it could be a real problem because of what we just talked about with Bernie. I mean, he's coming up from the backside. You got to keep, or from the defensive back, you got to keep Reese healthy. And if your defensive tackles can't occupy the offensive linemen, it becomes very difficult for those linebackers to fill those gaps consistently and stop the run. So, that's the place that I think maybe if you really want to talk about the key to Georgia, I think up front at the defensive tackle is the space you got to look at.
Yeah, I agreed there. Keep Marco Wilson healthy as well. And, cornerback's not getting picked on. I think that you go there, the cornerback position, and Felipe Frank's playing well in that game because the two times he's played against Georgia has not been pretty as well. So
falling on the goal line probably wouldn't be good again.
Yeah. So here we go. Lindy's the best and brightest. They have LaMichael Pirine as the most valuable player for the Gators coming in. Led Florida in total yards from scrimmage, 996, and finished second on the team in scoring, 48 points. He needs 1,191 rushing yards to become the first career 3,000-yard rusher at UF since Ernest Graham in 99-2002. So LaMichael Pirine can leave with some lofty results here. Easily Florida's best pass catching back, has tallied 32 career catches with 3 touchdowns, had 100-yard efforts versus Vanderbilt, 121, and Florida State with 129. Should be featured as the primary back this season after splitting carries with Jordan Scarlett in 2018. Will, the emerging star Lindy's has here, safety Brad Stewart helped Florida seal the 27-19 victory over LSU with an interception return for a touchdown late in the fourth quarter. Started only 7 of the 11 games he appeared in, but he seemed to be earning more trust from the coaches in spring practice. Elite athlete who has the highest upside of any Florida safety. So, Will, before I move on to who they have listed as the top newcomer there, Brad Stewart as the emerging star. It did catch my eye. He is a playmaker. We all remember that game-changing interception against LSU to basically put that game away. Off-field issues, wasn't able necessarily to get back into rotation as the season wore on last year. He needs to be on the field.
Yeah, I mean, I think he obviously showed his ability. We've seen just on that particular play what he was able to do, but there have been other times as well where he's shown flashes, and but flashes don't make you the breakout. You got to show those flashes consistently, and that's sort of, I think, in many cases, maybe where Florida is going to have to show some progress this year is just consistency across the board. I mean, consistency at the quarterback position, consistency up front of the defensive tackles, and consistency on the back end. I'm surprised maybe, Stewart has some competition there. I know there's been quite a bit of buzz about Huggins back there in the defensive backfield as well, potentially getting some time. Though, some of that's sort of been back up at the star position for Trey Dean, things like that. But, hey, I think if you think Florida's defensive backs are going to be good, then the safeties are going to have to sort of lead the way. And Stewart is probably one of the more talented guys to be able to do that.
Heck, I bet that interception against Tennessee late, or not late, but deep down the field where he just kind of picks it over the wide receiver there. I mean, that was a heck of a play. I mean, he's basically fighting for the receiver there. He goes up, picks the ball right out of the air for a heck of an interception there. So, yeah, he's definitely got the talent, top-end talent there that Florida needs on the field. here. Top newcomer that they have is not a freshman, Will. It is transfer Jonathan Grenard, who they have as the top newcomer for the Gators. Louisville grad transfer, eligible to play right away in 2019 for Florida. Racked up 15 and a half tackles for a loss, including 7 sacks for Louisville in 2017. Suffered a season-ending hand injury in the season opener against Alabama last year. His first start came against LSU in the Citrus Bowl after the 2016 season. He had 5 tackles, 1.5 for loss versus LSU in that game. He was recruited to Louisville by current Florida defensive coordinator Todd Grantham, who coached Grenard at Louisville in 2015 and 2016. Something else that caught my eye when going through Lindy's magazine, Will, is they have Grenard listed as the number 2 ranked transfer, non-quarterback transfer in the country. So they have some lofty some lofty expectations here for Grenard and what he can do in replacing Ja'Kai Polite this year for the Gators.
Yeah, well, I mean, he certainly played well when he was at Louisville. It was in Grantham's system, so he doesn't really have much of a learning curve. You've got Zuniga on the other side, so he's got sort of a running partner where they can't just double team him. So I get where they're coming from on that. I think Grenard certainly, when he's been healthy, has been able to play very, very well. And so that's, the hand injury, you don't figure it's not like a hamstring. It's not something, arthritic with his knee or anything like that. So you figure that he'll probably be able to recover from that and be able to play consistently. And if he ends up injured, it's just because of something else. It's not because of carryover from last year or anything like that. So, I'm excited to see what he can do. Certainly, they're going to have to put some pressure on the quarterback. They were able to do that last year. That's part of why the defense was able to be effective. In fact, you mentioned it earlier that there were some games where the defensive line kind of disappeared, and those were the games where Florida really struggled. And so they're not going to be able to disappear. And the key here is that Louisville, except for when they play Clemson, doesn't play the kind of talent that Florida plays on a week-to-week basis. So again, Grenard is a different kind of player than Ja'Kai Polite. The question is he more consistent? Is he better? I think maybe he'll be more consistent. I don't know that he's better top end. And so, that's going to sort of be the question is, does the consistency mean that, maybe he's not explosive and just causing havoc against a team like Tennessee, it does mean that he's consistent and is able to put pressure on Fromm when they play Georgia. And that's sort of going to be the key is are you just consistent, or do you have dry spells throughout the year, and can he avoid those?
All right, well, here we go. My favorite part of these magazines, opposing coaches. Here's Athlon's part, sizing up Florida here. So here we go. Quote, Dan Mullen did a really nice job with his year 1. He got the culture back and got the locker room back. They're not nearly what they used to be, but you saw Florida football at times, especially down the stretch. But they're losing a lot this year. Could be an interesting kind of quarterback battle. This is the part that really kind of caught my eye. An opposing coach says could be an interesting kind of quarterback battle between Felipe Franks and Emory Jones. Jones can run better than Felipe, but doesn't have the arm or the experience. Dan is really good at making his quarterbacks look more versatile than they really are. How are they going to feature Jones more often? I don't think Franks is in danger of losing his job or anything, but they want to bring Jones along and use him as a weapon more often. The running backs and receivers are solid, but not spectacular. But we expect that offense to be humming so long as they can find the right replacement starters for the offensive line through the summer. Defensively, they lose their ends, but they always recruit well to that position. The good news is they got their corners back. If they keep a healthy secondary, they can focus on developing the pass rush. The state of the program is that they're ahead of schedule, but still not comparable to Georgia or Alabama or LSU. You can't get that far in 1 year. Okay, I'm not throwing LSU in that mix right now with Alabama and Georgia. Sorry. Then let's see. Dan has to change his recruiting philosophy, not because it doesn't work, but because of where he's at. He recruited development guys because he's had to at Mississippi State, and that's great. A lot of staffs can't do that. But at Florida, you don't have to develop 3 stars into 4 stars, or you don't develop 3 stars into 4 stars. You develop 5 stars into NFL players. So, well, it kind of goes back to our recruiting argument. Why make it hard on yourself if you don't really have to? Go out there and get the best. You're a proven great coach. You're a proven great developer. Go develop 4- and 5-star talent, not the – look, we saw what the limitations were at Mississippi State. And, the baseline talent is going to be better at Florida. And that's why you kind of see a 10-win first year here. But there's some interesting remarks about recruiting here from an opposing SEC coach. A lot of Emory Jones talk and maybe how much playing time he gets this year. And the running backs and receivers are solid, but not spectacular there. Is there an in between for solid and spectacular? Because that's probably where I'm at.
Well, I mean, when's the last time we saw a guy take one to the house for when a play wasn't blocked perfectly?
Yeah.
When's the last time we saw a guy break 3 or 4 tackles and take it to the house? It wasn't last year. I mean, P. Ryan had a couple of really long runs, and I mean, those are great runs for him, but they weren't plays where he was trapped and all of a sudden he was able to break it and he took it to the house. And, there are guys who, Dalvin Cook at Florida State was like that.
Man, that's exactly who. When you were mentioning that, that's exactly where I went. It was a Dalvin Cook type of running back.
Right. But I mean, the guy who can, and the guy that you give him the ball over and over and over again, and maybe he gets a yard and then 2 yards and then 2.5 yards. And you sort of get him by the ankle a few times and then pop. All of a sudden, the offense kicks into gear just because he's able to rip off a 60-yard run that probably shouldn't have been a 50-yard or probably should have been a 50 or 60-yard run to begin with. And this maybe is where they're coming from with Emory Jones, right? I mean, there's no need to protect him. You don't need the red shirt. You kind of want to protect Franks from running. So do you bring Emory Jones in and then sort of, have them both on the field at the same time, do some things that they used to do with Tebow when Leak was still there? I think you can very, very likely see stuff like that. And, I mean, I would sort of agree with the assessment of the running backs and the wide receivers right now. Just they have shown to be very, very good. But I haven't seen a guy who's been able to I haven't seen a guy who's been a game changer yet. And maybe that's Tony. I think it's more likely to be Grimes. And if Grimes can do that, then obviously they take a leap and the offense takes a leap as well. I do find it interesting that everybody just sort of glosses over the offensive line. It's like, as long as the offensive line plays well, everything should go to plan. It's like, well, that's a big question mark.
That's a big question mark, yeah.
And so, I get everybody's got them 10-2, and I understand that everybody's very, very optimistic after year one. But this is one of those things where the overall team may be better, but just because of a certain unit, there may be some growing pains, especially early on. And, I hope not, but we'll see.
All right. Well, Lindy's and their opposing coach view here, a little bit shorter here. On Dan Mullen, Mullen did a hell of a job with quarterback Felipe Franks. Franks was very average before Dan got there. One thing about Mullen at Florida, he will have as good or better defenses than he had at Mississippi State, and he's not playing a West schedule in the SEC. So if he can duplicate at Florida on offense what he did at State, he'll challenge for the East every year. More on Mullen. If he can get the best athletes in the state of Florida and coach them up, he'll win a lot of games. And he's got a really good defensive coordinator in Todd Grantham. Mullen got as much out of his talent as anybody in the league, and I think Florida would be much improved. I got a lot of respect for Mullen. There's an argument that he's the best quarterback coach in all of the Southeast. But, Will, we have to go back to that second part in the first sentence. If he can get the best athletes in the state of Florida. We had an episode on that a couple of weeks ago after DeMarcus Bowman chose Clemson there. So there a lot of the – I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say, we have the acumen of coaches or anything, but a lot of the same theme here. If Mullen can get the best athletes and mostly the best athletes in the home state, he's going to do a lot of damage.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's what the magazines are really telling you, right? They're telling you that Florida has more talent than Mississippi State, and it's really not even close. And Mullen is a very, very good coach, and I think that's been proven out. And I think it's also been proven out when you take a closer look at the numbers in terms of his ability to get more 3-stars to the NFL than a typical peer. His win-loss record against teams that have more talent than his team does. I think when you look at it, you say, okay, yes, there are really, really positive signs here. And he's got top 10 recruiting talent. I mean, he had a top 10 class this past year, though it drops lower when you start factoring in the attrition. But, Florida, even if you take McElwain's players and McElwain's recruiting classes is in that like 13 to 14 range nationally. And so they ought to be a top 10 or, top 15 team based on those players that they have. I mean, that's the reality. Now, I think last year you look at it and say, okay, well, it's a new system, a new quarterback, or a new system for the quarterback. We don't really know what we have in our quarterbacks. You're really happy with 10-3. I think the expectations ratcheted up this year. I mean, I think 6-8. I think you really got to be happy with that if that's where they end up. At the end of the day, though, when we talk about recruiting and when we say something either is or isn't good enough, we're not saying that it's not good enough for Florida to be a very, very, very good team. What we're saying is that it's not comparable to what's happening at Georgia and Alabama, and even though you dismissed it at LSU. So, it doesn't mean it's not.
But that's just based on the recruiting part of it. Now, yeah, if you look at recruiting numbers and stuff, then LSU is recruiting better than Florida. I still have a hard time believing that's going to be enough for LSU to catch up to Georgia and Alabama and actually separate themselves from Florida.
Yeah, well, I mean, and
overall.
Well, and we've never said that recruiting is the only
No, right. Yep.
But I do think it's striking that these preseason magazines, when they're talking to the coaches are saying that Florida needs to get better horses. And when they do, watch out, because Mullen is the type of coach who's really going to be able to make those guys run. And that is the argument, right? That if you put Mullen at Georgia right now, I don't think anybody would be talking about Florida. Like if you switch the coaches, right? You put Kirby at Florida, you put Mullen at Georgia, and you had the same rosters. I mean, we'd be sitting there going, "Oh."
They're at number 1 or number 2 instead of Alabama.
Yeah. So, I mean, hey, I think, and I've said this over and over again, if Mullen is able to win the SEC consistently with just top 10 recruiting classes, I think it says a lot about his coaching acumen and a lot about his ability to develop players, and really sort of, I think, indicates that that development plays a larger role than maybe I give it credit for. At the same time, we'll see, right? I mean, the good part is we get to see it on the field, but it is telling to me that the coaches that they're interviewing here, giving these anonymous remarks, point out the same types of things that we're pointing out in terms of talent coming in, keeping the talent in the state, drawing a circle around Gainesville, and making sure you bring those guys in, because traditionally that's very, very important.
All right. Well, for the sake of time here, we'll get to some other things, but there's some unit rankings and kind of the all SEC teams and all American teams. We'll push that to a later point. We can kind of feature on specific talent at a later date here to kind of save some time here. One thing I did want to get in on, and of course, we're speaking about what these coaches said and what they think about Dan Mullen. Well, Athlon a year ago, Will. And they had Dan Mullen ranked as the 3rd best new hire behind Scott Frost and Chip Kelly. That was, all of the 2018 new hires, last year's edition of Athlon ranked Dan Mullen 3rd behind Scott Frost and Chip Kelly. A year later, the magazine's released and they ranked the 2018 new coaches, and Dan Mullen comes in at number 1. There, so no surprise there. I think after a 10-3 season, of course, turning around Florida at 4-7, they say here Gators improved in every facet of the game in Mullen's first season, and they're on the verge of returning to national relevance. Here's an amazing stat: Florida ranked 6th in the SEC in total offense in 2018, marking the first time since 2009 that the Gators finished higher than 10th in the league in that category. The offensive renaissance should continue in Gainesville in 2019.
Yeah, well, I mean, you certainly hope so, right? I mean, I think that's what Mullen's paid for, was to score points. He said that when he came in. I anticipate that they're still going to be pretty effective on that side of the ball. I anticipate that they're going to get better as the year goes on because of some of the youth that they have on that side of the ball too. But there's a little bit of a mismatch in terms of timing, right? The wide receivers are all relatively older guys. The skill position guys are older. Jefferson, Grimes,
and right there, Will, before you go, 2 of those were transfers, Grimes and Jefferson.
Yep. And then the offensive line is relatively inexperienced. So it's interesting, just sort of the mismatch in terms of the experience there. But I mean, I would be very, very interested. And I don't know if you have the information or have the magazines so you can go back and look. Yeah. But where was Jim McElwain ranked after his 2015
Oh, man. I do not have those. Yeah.
I think it's dangerous to say 1 year, let's re-rank these guys. I mean, obviously, Chip Kelly has put a dumpster fire at UCLA.
And they may just be ranking on 2018 alone.
Sure. Yeah. But I mean, that's all you got to go on, right?
Yeah.
But I think people are going to be – I think Frost is a good coach. And
they have him at number 5, by the way. Yeah, even after they just went 4-8. They started 0-6, I believe. and ended the season 4-8. So they still had him in the top 5.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you look back 5 years from now, and that's when you're going to say how good of a hire was that. And certainly Florida in the past, you've been able to say it after year 2, right? I mean, when Urban Meyer won the national championship in 2006, everybody was like, all right, that was a good hire. But I think 3 or 4 years from now, you'll be able to look back and really say that. And I think everybody would agree that Jim McElwain was not the right hire at this point. The question was, what did people think in 2015? I think, again, I think Mullen has earned being at that number 1 spot, but it's just like anything else in college football. You get to number 1 of the polls, and it doesn't mean anything until you until you finish number 1 of the polls. So if they're still calling him the best coach or the best new hire from 2 years ago at the end of for the magazines for next year, then Florida will have really done something.
All right, just some other coaches of note there from the 2018 new coaches. They had Jimbo Fisher 3rd at Texas A&M, of course. I mentioned Scott Frost at 5. Jeremy Pruitt 9 there. So they're at Tennessee, of course, 4-8 to 5-7. Joe Moorhead 10 to Mississippi State. Chip Kelly, who was ranked number 2 as the new hire last year, all the way to 12th. Will so man. Recruiting talk at Florida, is dramatic. But if we were covering Chip Kelly at Florida and they had the similar results of what they're doing at UCLA right now, oh man, it would be ugly. It would be so bad.
Put it this way, I'm glad that my article on Chip Kelly did not come out. When there were rumors about him taking the Florida job, I might have written something, and it might have been more rosy than what he's shown at UCLA.
Yeah. Hey,
so where's Taggart on this list?
Willie Taggart is
121st.
He is 21st, out of 21.
Okay, I was gonna say, who's Taggart?
I can't reach it now. I have the old Athlon at my feet somewhere just to kind of see where they had Mullen last year, because I forgot. I don't remember where they had Willie Taggart ranked going into last year.
You got to tweet that out after the show, Dave.
Yeah, I will. But yeah, out of 21 2018 hires, Willie Taggart is 21st.
Oof, man. So maybe they won't be 25th at the end of the year.
Okay, here's what they say, by the way. Taggart's first season in Tallahassee was a debacle. The Seminoles suffered through their first losing season since 1976, Bobby Bowden's first year on campus. They lost a staggering 6 games by 19 points or more, including setbacks of 30-7 at Syracuse, 59-10 at home versus Clemson, and 41-14 versus rival Florida in the season finale. Taggart will need to show significant progress in every facet of the program in year 2 to keep the fan base from revolting.
Oh, yeah. Well, the problem is they don't have any money, so they can't get rid of him. So he's basically there. Maybe I do want him to be bad, because they
can't get rid of him.
The funds to get rid of him, even if he is bad. So, I don't know. We'll leave him alone for now. But that, man, it was a bad year out there in Tallahassee. So, I mean, when you compare what happened in Gainesville compared to what happened in Tallahassee, I mean, the teams basically have roughly equivalent talent. You can even make an argument that Florida State has more, and I think you can make a pretty convincing argument they do. And for that to be the disparity between the two programs, I think you got to feel good about it, about Florida's program, the direction it's heading when you make that comparison.
All right, well, last thing here, the Athlon betting guide they have here, and really, really caught me by surprise here. Of their, of course, there's a reason I'm bringing it up, because it's Florida related here. They have the Gators as the best value for a national title favorite at 33-1 odds. Their summary here: the Gators get Miami early, Auburn at home, and Florida State at home. If they can get by LSU in Death Valley, the Georgia game could have SEC championship game implications and college football playoff implications. At 33-1, we get a non-Clemson, non-Alabama team with the talent to win it with a schedule that sets up positively. So it is a tough schedule. It is, but you do have, you have Miami on a neutral site at home, and Manny Diaz's first game. Auburn still trying to figure out what they're going to do. Gus Malzahn's calling plays, but who's the quarterback? You beat LSU last year. You do have to go to Baton Rouge. The Georgia game, look, and even with this, you could afford one loss probably. If you with this schedule, if you're Florida, some weird things would probably have to happen if you're a one-loss Florida and you don't get into a playoff, even if you don't make it to the SEC championship game. there. You do get Florida State to end the season at home as well. And we just got through talking about the problems there. 33-1 odds, and Athlon finds that as the best value for a team to win the national championship. Will.
Yeah, I think the other thing is when you look at Georgia's schedule, they've got at Auburn and versus Texas A&M as their cross matches with the West. So certainly you can imagine a scenario where if they get caught in that game at Auburn and then have to come in the next week against a Texas A&M team that may be rolling, maybe they get caught by some SEC opponents and allows, even if Florida were to lose to Georgia, if Florida only has one SEC loss, maybe they're able to get to the SEC championship game. Also they have versus Notre Dame early in the year. So again, a top 10 team that Georgia's going to be playing, and maybe some of the attrition of a schedule that there could be some attrition by the time you get towards the back end of that schedule. Whereas Florida's playing Vanderbilt and Missouri and Florida State in the last 3 games. I think Georgia has a different schedule on that side with Auburn, Texas A&M, and then Georgia Tech, who also should be a little bit better. So I think you look at that and say, okay, based on schedule, maybe Georgia struggles a little bit. I don't know whether I necessarily believe that, but you can say that. A few weeks ago, we talked about Florida having like a 10% chance at making the playoff, I think was what was listed for the ESPN FPI.
Yep.
And it was like the 5th or 6th highest team in terms of percentages to make the playoff. And I think that is indicative of just sort of the strength of the SEC and the respect that it garners, that the SEC is the only conference that typically fights for 2 playoff spots. So there's a possibility to get a second playoff spot. And once you get in the Final Four, anything can happen. I think there's also just a realization that if everything goes right, if Florida gets a little bit lucky, right, you go to Baton Rouge and all of a sudden Orgeron has a brain cramp and Florida's able to get out of there and steal a game that maybe they wouldn't have won otherwise. They position themselves in a good place for that. So it doesn't surprise me that an SEC team would be the bet that Vegas would have. I mean, I'd want to look at somebody like Utah is somebody that you look at and say, okay, if they're a huge bet, just because they come from the Pac-12, they can probably drop a couple games and still make the playoff. Maybe that's a team that you might think about. But certainly, I think if you're betting for the national champion, you will have done pretty well if you've betted for the SEC against the field the last few years. Actually, the last 2 decades. So I understand why that would be something that they'd look at.
Yeah, they do have. Speaking of Utah, and I'm going back to that team again. They do have them to bet the win total of over 8.5 there. So yeah, I mean they beat Washington there. So that's I don't know. I mean. I think they're in the Pac-12 South, so I think they have Arizona State, USC, UCLA. I think is how that breaks out. So Washington and Oregon are the other 2 best teams in the Pac-12, and Utah has the advantage of playing in the South.
Yeah, well, again, the odds are set to. Like the reason it's a good bet is that you bet a very little bit of money and you make quite a bit of money, which means they don't necessarily think, or at least Vegas doesn't think it's very likely, or people who are betting in Vegas don't think it's very likely that Florida would make the playoffs or even win the championship. And again, I think that sort of is tied into the strength of the SEC, that you figure that there's a pecking order and that Florida is maybe 4th in that pecking order. If you think about, you got Alabama and then you got Georgia. And then if you think about LSU, Auburn, Florida.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right now, if you go by these magazines, Athlon has Florida 4th overall and Lindy's has Florida 3rd overall in the SEC.
But they also both have them as top 10 teams, right?
Yep,
so they're both sitting there saying if one thing goes their way in a game where, Fromm goes down on the opening play, or Fromm, God forbid, tears an ACL or something the 3rd week of the season, who's the backup at Georgia?
There is no depth right there. Actually, a guy from my hometown in Pierce County, Stetson Bennett, would probably be their backup quarterback. In Pierce County, Georgia. So he's the backup right now to Jake Fromm. So I mean, I don't wish Jake Fromm to get hurt or anything. No, it'd be cool to see a guy from my hometown down in South Georgia. He was a walk-on now, so that kind of lets you know where the talent level is. And if he's playing quarterback for Georgia, it's not an ideal scenario for them.
Well, but those are the kinds of things you look at and say, first week of the season, you go, oh, there's no way Florida can beat Georgia. But then as you get, 8-9 games in, there's attrition, right? And if Georgia's offensive line is struggling, maybe they get an injury, a rolled ankle or something for Fromm, and then he can't play in the game. So I think if you think Florida's going to be a top 10 team, they only need to win one more game than you think they're going to in order to get into that conversation. So if all I need is one more game, I think it makes sense that they would think that Florida's a good bet based on the odds and where they sit in Vegas.
Well, I think one reason they're looking at that too, and since we're on the Florida Georgia topic before we wrap this episode up, the betting guide does out of 3 games, the whole nation that they're picking right here. Florida Georgia is one of the games that they're looking up at as of right now. Georgia is a 4-point favorite over Florida. So they say here in the world's largest outdoor cocktail party, Georgia is listed as more than a field goal favorite per betonline.ag. And this game could have major ramifications in the national title race. Florida poses a ton of challenges this year, and while both teams will be very good, the Gators finally have the coaching to hang with Georgia. The Bulldogs are focused on a return to the college football playoff, but should they escape the first 2 months unblemished, things could derail in Jacksonville. So, I mean, you've heard throughout this preview here of the college football magazines a lot of Florida Georgia talk. Can Florida close the gap there? And they're looking at that game as a national shakeup game, but for betting college football.
Yeah, well, I mean, this really is a development versus talent argument, I think, because if you go back and watch the Georgia game, and like I said, for the article I wrote on Frank's last week, I had gone back and looked at every offensive play. If you rewatch that Georgia game, it's a lot closer than it should be. I mean, Georgia jumps out to a big lead. I think it was 10-0, and it should have been more than that. And then, Florida struggles. Franks drops the ball basically on his own goal line when he's running just an off tackle run, and they're not able to punch it in. There were a lot of sort of curious decisions by Kirby Smart. The fact that he only threw it to Nauta at the end of the first half and the beginning of the second half, and then never went back to the tight end, even though he was torching the Florida defense with that. So there are a lot of things.
And speaking around that same time, Florida takes the lead after halftime.
Absolutely. So, I mean, if you look at the stats and where they stood with Florida in the lead, they really had no business being in the lead in that game. And I think a lot of it goes back to, if they are really only 4 points separated, and Smart takes 2 field goals that are less than 20 yards, I think Florida wins the game. Just because you can't pass up points there when your teams are much more equivalent. And certainly the way Frank's played the last 4 games of the year, if he plays like that, then it's going to be a lot closer game. So I think there is a path to where Florida can be very, very good and can compete with Georgia and potentially even win that game. But obviously a lot of things have to go right. And I think that's sort of what they're saying in terms of where the odds stand, but also in terms of where they have Florida situated overall nationally, but also in the SEC.
Well, it's so good to buy these preseason magazines. Florida's ranked in the top 10. There's a lot of positivity. And look, we've discussed this before with the podcast, a lot of expectations, heightened expectations. And that's a good thing because it beats what, last year, which was an unknown, coming off a 4-win season. And a year later, we get these preseason magazine and Florida is firmly in the top 10.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, ever since I've joined the podcast, we haven't known who the quarterback was during the off season. But it's just nice to know who the quarterback is. And, last year I had a whole sequence where I was going over every guy in the depth chart and sort of looking at his high school film and trying to decide who was the best guy for the job and all that.
Kadarius Toney.
Hey, he threw a touchdown pass last year. I feel good. But I think at the end of the day, it's clear that it's going to be Felipe Franks who's going to be the starter. And just that level of continuity makes you feel good going into the year, right? Yep. Now, you might have said that a few years ago when Driscoll was coming back after 2012. Yeah. Obviously, he got hurt, and then you had all the sort of the shenanigans that went on with all the quarterbacks getting hurt that year and having a much more difficult year than we anticipated. But you don't think that's going to happen in year 2 with Mullen, particularly with Savage and some of the things we've seen with the strength and conditioning program, and really just that Mullen hasn't had those sorts of downturns even when he was at Mississippi State. I mean, he hasn't, didn't have 4 and 8 years and games or years where the offense just looked completely incompetent. So even if he has to go back and rely on Emory Jones for a few games because of an injury, I think we can be pretty confident that he'll at least be able to scheme around his weaknesses or areas where he maybe doesn't have experience to be more effective.
As I said, probably next week or the week after, we'll dive into some more things I wanted to get into with this episode as far as the unit ranking and where the quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers as a group and the defense as a group ranks in the SEC and all the all SEC teams, all American teams as well. So we'll get to that. I didn't think we I actually thought we would wrap everything up in an hour, but no, there's still 2 topics I wanted to get to, so plenty of time to get to this.
Well, this is effective summer podcasting day.
It is.
That over multiple weeks, and then inevitably it gets bumped because something else happens, and we got to talk about that. So hopefully nothing happens. And
the last time we planned an episode for Felipe Franks, it got pushed like 3 times. So.
So yeah, I mean, I look forward to talking about all these guys and where they stand on the depth chart and all that sort of stuff. We obviously have opinions, but I'm interested to hear what these publications say, and certainly as Phil Steele's comes out as well, I'm interested to see what he has to say.
All right. That's Will Miles. You can find his Will. What you got coming up? Reading reaction, by the way.
I have no idea. I got a few
things
working at home, and I took this week off just because it was Memorial Day, and quite honestly didn't have time. So we'll get back at it this week. Probably a little bit on recruiting, but we'll see whether I have time.
All right. So readingreaction.com is where you can find Will, and at Will Miles SEC on Twitter. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.